All right. So the next question comes from Jessica Carmack of Bardstown, Kentucky. And she asks, if you could have all of the answers, information, solutions to solve one case, which one would it be and why? Again, I mean, I've discussed Candace Hiltz. I've discussed the Fort Worth 3. Since this question seems to be coming up multiple times, I'm going to give you a different answer every time because I assume I'm going to get asked this question again in here. If I could have all the information and I could solve any case tomorrow, probably another case that I would say this applies to would be the murder of Suzanne Joven, which I did early on, possibly episode 5. I don't have all my episode numbers memorized. That's just such a bizarre case, and I feel like that's a super solvable case that was messed up a lot by poor investigative work. The police chose a suspect, they zeroed in on that suspect, and despite the fact that almost all pieces of evidence pointed away from that suspect, they refused to look at anybody else. Then there were mistakes with how long it took them to process DNA, lab errors that contaminated the DNA. That's a case that should have really been solved, and someone out there committed a murder and is running around free. Or possibly not. There is a theory that the person who may have done this is deceased, but that's a case that I would love to see solved. Yeah. In addition to that, Jessica asks, if you have the time to answer a second question, I do. I'd like to know what crime story introduced you to true crime, and do you remember at what age? I've been obsessed with true crime since I was young. I remember being a kid and watching shows like Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. And so a specific case that really got me hooked is hard to answer, but probably something like episode 1, Kurt Sova. That's just a bizarre case, and as a kid it haunted me, and it still haunts me to this day. So that was definitely a case that pulled me in. I remember seeing the initial segment on Unsolved Mysteries, and at a young age just wondering, how is it possible that this could happen and nobody could have the answers? How could all these bizarre circumstances revolve around this kid's death? And we don't have the answers. So Kurt Sova was definitely a case that got me interested. All right. So the next question comes from Megan Roberts in Maine, and she asks, what are some of your favorite podcasts? That's a hard question to answer. I have tons of podcasts on my iPod right now. In terms of true crime, 2 podcasts that really inspired me were The Vanished and The Trail Went Cold. They're very different. The Vanished is more interviews with family members, discussions of a disappeared person, whereas Robin, who hosts The Trail Went Cold, takes a more factual, chronological approach to things. I love both of those. I am not huge on the comedy true crime podcast side. I used to listen to Last Podcast on the Left a lot. I don't listen as much as I used to. I don't really have the time. And their episodes, obviously, over time have gotten much longer. Their research has gotten better. They commit a lot more time to it. So I used to like that one. It was one of the only comedy true crime podcasts that I could deal with. Outside of true crime, I listen to a lot. So the easiest way for me to answer this is to take a look at my iPod and tell you what's on here. So right now I have the Another Zelda podcast. Are You Afraid of the Podcast, which is great. They go through episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark, which was a show that I loved as a kid and frankly probably love as an adult. I have it on DVD. The Completely Unnecessary podcast, great. A lot of video game stuff, a lot of just entertainment stuff. Love both of those guys. I've started recently listening to Disgraceland. That's a good new podcast you should check out. Death, Sex, and Money is another great podcast that I listen to. Covers different aspects of life, most of which revolve around death, sex, or money. The episodes are short. They often involve interviews, but they're really fascinating. Beyond those, the Not So Common podcast, which is Pat Contry, one of the hosts of the Completely Unnecessary podcast. This is more of an interview-based podcast that he does. Something to Wrestle With is a podcast that I listen to a lot. I grew up as a wrestling fan, and they go really comprehensively detailed into the stories behind the scenes of a lot of the stuff I was watching as a kid. Let's see. Those Conspiracy Guys, I find them very entertaining, and their episodes are long. I mean, you get like a 6-hour episode out of them, and they cover some of the craziest conspiracies out there. So it's fun to hear their take on them. WTF, Mark Maron's podcast. His interviews are great. He gets awesome people in there. They go really in depth. I absolutely love that podcast. And then there's another podcast, which I'm currently looking for in my iPod because you should know about it. Is this it? Yeah, it's called Talking Tolkien. And it's a podcast that revolves around going through the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and examining them and going in depth. I'm currently listening to their series where they go through every chapter of the Silmarillion. I don't know if you've ever tried to read Tolkien, but if you try to read the Silmarillion, you can get lost very fast. And listening to them discuss it, they're entertaining while they do it, and they give you so much in-depth information, I can't help but want to hear every episode. So I hope that answers your question, and I hope I didn't answer it too long. All right, so the next question is from Nicole Battle from Melbourne, Australia. And she asks, what was the case that first got you interested in true crime? I sort of answered along the lines of this earlier with the Kurt Sova answer, and that's certainly a case that got me hooked. But that sort of opened the door to true crime for me. If I had to choose a case that like sunk its hooks in and is the reason I stuck with it, it's probably a case like the Zodiac killer. I've been obsessed with that case forever. I've watched everything there is on it. I've read tons of books about it. That's a fascinating, twisted, dark case. I'm not so fascinated by the murder aspect of it. I'm more fascinated by the psychology, the behavior of the killer, the letters that he sent, the taunting, the phone calls. That is psychologically a very, very fascinating case to dig into. And there's so much rumor and speculation around it. Nobody knows what happened there. And you've got people who have selected suspects. I mean, there's an entire website dedicated to it, which lists suspects, and there's like 30 of them. And they all have some reasons they could be and some reasons they might not be. But I would say the Zodiac killer case played a big role in my obsession with true crime. All right, so the next question comes from Jessica Dennis of Seattle, Washington, and she asks, what do you think happened to Skye Metalwala? The disappearance of Skye Metalwala is a case I covered early in the podcast. There's so much revolving around that case. It's really hard to say exactly what happened there, and I don't want to get myself into any legal trouble, but there's a lot of speculation that Skye's mother knows exactly what happened to Skye Metalwala, and there's a lot of rumor that Skye's mother was involved in some way. So I would say those are probably avenues to explore hypothetically. All right, so the next question comes from Desiree Bingham in Arizona, and she asks a couple of questions. Her first one, how many times per episode do you spin in your chair? I don't spin in my chair, frankly, and I'll tell you why. I am incredibly motion sick. If I look at a ceiling fan for more than 10 seconds, I will start to feel nauseous and dizzy. I can't read in a moving vehicle, which makes long road trips difficult if I'm not the driver. So I don't do a lot of spinning around unless I want to spend the next couple of hours laying on my couch feeling nauseous. She asks, do you sing your curses? So I posted a picture not too long ago of the sound wave of me cursing on the podcast when I mess up. I mess up quite a bit, and when I do, I'm known to use an expletive or two, and I cut those, obviously. I'm not going to include those, and I don't save them either. I've been asked for like a gag reel of mess-ups that I make on the show, but I don't save any of my mess-ups, and frankly, if you wanted to hear them, it would mostly be me yelling expletives, so I don't think that would serve a purpose for very many people. But no, I usually don't sing them. I usually scream them, which is probably why by the end of an episode, you can often hear my voice is a little raw. Desiree goes on and asks, who is your favorite Disney princess? I'll bet it's Jasmine. It is not Jasmine. I don't know her name, but she's essentially the forgotten Disney princess. She is the princess in the Disney movie The Black Cauldron. Nobody watches that movie. It wasn't highly rated. It's one of the only Disney cartoon movies at that time that received a PG rating and not a G rating. It's very dark, but it feeds into my love of fantasy, so I would choose her if I could remember her name. Okay, the next question comes from Monica Terzic. I hope I pronounced that right. And she asks, are there any cases that you've covered that you had a particularly emotional response to or had any personal influence on you? Yeah, I mean, most of them. Almost every case I've covered touches me in some way. I previously mentioned Candace Hilt's case. That case disturbs me on so many levels. The cases of children, Isabel Celis, or Solis, Garrett, those cases just really get to me. Garrett Phillips. Yeah, Skye Metalwala. The cases with children, they're just, when you're below a certain age, it's not that anybody ever deserves to disappear or go missing, but just trying to wrap your head around a parent accepting the fact that their 10 or 12-year-old child isn't coming home again, that bothers me to no end. Also, any case that I've covered where it seems solvable, it makes me angry. When I cover a case and it's like all the information is here, why isn't this solved? Obviously, I'm not an investigator on the case, and there's information I don't have, but it's hard not to feel an emotional connection to those cases. The next question is from Kay's Casey in Syracuse, New York, and she asks, would you be willing to make a podcast in regard to Elisa Lam? Yes. Episode 39, I just released it yesterday, actually. I covered the Elisa Lam case. How about controversial cases such as Seth Rich and Vince Foster? Again, I will definitely cover cases like that. The more controversy is stirred up around them, the better known they are. I sort of push them to the side and plan to do them later. I want to do lesser known cases and hit big ones here and there. If a case has been covered extensively or there's a lot of controversy around it, I will eventually get to it. But I don't want to just become one of those podcasts that does only the well-known cases. So I want to mix in the lesser-known ones. There's a lot of missing persons. There's a lot of murders that nobody knows about because they're not covered enough. So if I can bring light to those, I feel I buy myself the ability to do a couple episodes here and there that I'm really fascinated by or that are big-time episodes. So Elizabeth in Canada asks, what kind of music do you listen to? I'm not going to pull my iPod out on this one. I have a ton of music on my iPod. Suffice it to say, I listen to almost everything. I have country, rap, metal, glam, punk, pop punk. Everything is on there. I treat music in the same way that I treat literature. If it emotionally makes me respond, it's a good song, and I don't care what it is. So just some examples of bands that are on my podcast right now, that are on my iPod right now. I have Phil Collins on there, and then I'll have Stone Sour and Slipknot and Marilyn Manson, but then I have Johnny Cash and Codaline. I have tons and tons on there. I've got Miley Cyrus on my iPod. I've got Twisted Sister on my iPod. I listen to almost everything. There was a period of time where I was releasing these playlists on Spotify of the music that I was listening to when I wrote a particular episode. I don't know that anybody ever really looked at them. I kind of stopped doing it. But if that's something you'd be interested in me continuing to do, I'll definitely do it, and then you'll get much more of a sense of the music I listen to. So Carrie Webb of Seattle asks, how has creating this podcast affected your outlook on life? Are you more suspicious, empathetic, angry, despairing? No, I'm actually kind of the opposite. I've always been a very suspicious person. I don't trust people in general. The world's full of dark things. My father sort of ingrained that in me as a child. I remember playing in the backyard as a kid and him giving me the talk about strangers. And he would say things to me like, there are people out there who want to kidnap children. So you have to be careful. Don't go around strangers. Don't talk to them, all that kind of stuff. So throughout my life, that's continued to build up. So I'm automatically a little suspicious. But the podcast has actually affected my life very positively. I get so much information from people. So many people want to reach out and talk to me. It can make you a little paranoid when you're covering these horrible things all the time. But you got to keep doing it. To me, I'm driven to continue doing these episodes. Luckily, I haven't really received too many threats. I've gotten a few here and there, and I have those filed away in case something ever does happen to me. But I don't foresee that as being an issue. But yeah, in general, the podcast has had a really, really great effect. It's brought me out into the world. I thought when I did this podcast, a handful of people would listen. And maybe after a couple of years, I would get a couple 100,000 downloads. In 6 months, over 1 million downloads. That's thanks to all of you guys who listen, all of you people who ask questions, and even the ones who listen and don't really say much of anything. So just the fact that so many people care about my opinions on something or want to hear me address something, that does a lot for me. That very much helps me. So the podcast has had almost the opposite of a negative effect on me. It's been very, very positive, and it continues to drive me forward. So the next question comes from Freddie Valdivizio. I probably didn't pronounce that right, in Baltimore, Maryland. And he asks, "Hey, I began listening to your show this week, and I think you're doing a really good job. The podcast is so fun to listen to. Anyway, my question is as follows. Have you ever done an episode on the deaths of Arnold Archambault or Ruby Brugier? This mystery was featured on the Robert Stack Unsolved Mysteries show way back in the 80s. It's always been one of those mysteries that puzzles my mind. Let me know your thoughts. Once again, thank you for the amazing podcast." Well, thank you for your question. I watch a lot of Unsolved Mysteries, especially now that it's on Amazon Prime Video. I watch it all the time. And I definitely sometimes will watch it and see a case and make a note to look into it. The two particular cases you have asked me about, I have not looked into yet, but they're probably on my list. My list is very comprehensive. It started off as like 10 possible cases and it's grown to over 100. So if I haven't added that to my list yet, I will add it to my list. I'll take a look, and I'm willing to cover almost anything. So whenever someone says, "Would you be willing to look into this?" Absolutely. What stops me sometimes from covering a case is lack of information. You wouldn't believe how many cases were covered on Unsolved Mysteries, and then when you research them, really all you can find is what Unsolved Mysteries said about the case. So I'll definitely take a look, and we'll see if I get to covering them someday. Okay, Leah Budd from East Central Illinois asks, "I know you do a lot of research in preparation for each podcast, but my question to you is, do you go so far as to contacting the family, or their friends, or anyone closely associated with that particular case?" For the most part, I do this after release of the episode. I don't like to do it before because I don't want the influence of people who may have built-in opinions or are very passionate about the subject. Obviously, it's very important to get their input, but you don't want it to influence the bias of the show. Everything that you listen to, every podcast, every documentary, they have an angle, they have a bias. I'm sure I do. I try very hard not to. I try very hard to just give you, here's the facts, and let's just look at those. So I don't like to talk to them beforehand because I don't want them to too much influence the direction that I might go with things. I do talk to them afterwards if I can. Some families I haven't reached out to. If a family has been very closed off to the media, doesn't want to do interviews, I'm not going to reach out to them and bother them. You have to understand that in a lot of these cases, it's not that they want to forget what happened, but they're dealing with it every day, and they don't need the constant reminders. So I don't want to be the kind of person who's going to drag them down and add more pain into their lives. I have spoken to several family members after I've done shows. For the most part, they've been happy with the coverage that I gave it or that I touched on the case. Some of them have pointed out things that may or may not be factual. Those are updates that are coming in the future. But for now, I think I'll continue to approach it the way that I do. That isn't to say in the future you won't see some episodes where I am interviewing a family member, but they would be as additions to the actual episode. I will not do a straight-up trace evidence episode in which I directly interview a family member. The next question comes from Darren Burke, who's located in Great Shefford, Hungerford, United Kingdom. And he asks, "If you could solve one of the cases you've done, which one would it be and why? I know they're all important, but which one gets you the most? Keep up the brilliant work." Well, thanks, Darren. Since I've given a couple of cases on this already, I'll definitely give you a different one. Brandon Lawson. It's one of the most controversial cases that I've done. What happened there? I actually spoke to a college class about this case. I've done a lot of work with this case. I've spoken to a lot of people, and I've gotten, information from sources that may or may not be reliable, that there's more going on behind the scenes than we're aware of. It's very hard to know. If you're not going to let me disclose your information, if you're not going to give me evidence that I can see for myself, I can't really go with what you're telling me, because it could just be rumor or speculation. There are a lot of people out there who believe they know what happened in cases, and they want to tell you. That doesn't mean that they're correct. But Brandon's case is certainly a disturbing one that I would love to know more about. The next question comes from Joellen Gilfus in Syracuse, New York. Joellen's a friend of mine. She's one of those people I mentioned that I play PlayStation 4 with. And she asks, "Do you ever find yourself relating too much to the subjects in your podcast?" I guess that depends what you mean by subjects. I certainly don't relate to the criminals. But do I relate to the victims and their families? Absolutely. I definitely take these cases with me. They stay in my head. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've woken up in the middle of the night to jot down notes on a case that I covered 3 months ago. So yeah, sometimes they stick with me a little too much. Sometimes I relate a little bit too much to them. I have known people who have passed away. I have known people who have moved away. I've never known anyone who absolutely vanished, and I've never known someone who was murdered. But I can sort of get on that empathetic level with the loss of someone I love. And to lose someone I love, and to know why, is hard enough to accept. So the idea of losing someone I love and never having the answer, I don't know how people live with that. And I guess they don't have a choice. You have to go on. But I give them a great deal of credit because I don't know that I could do it. So yeah, I can sometimes relate to the subjects a little too much. The next question comes from Jennifer in Chicago, and she asks, "Hey, I love your podcast and appreciate the work you do to get it to be of such high quality. You're very thorough and always challenge me to think about cases in a lot of different ways. Now that that's out of the way, here's my questions. Question 1. What case, be it solved or unsolved, do you think you've spent the most time thinking about? Another way to ask my question is, which case can you never seem to get out of your head?" The case that I can never get out of my head is the Zodiac killer. I previously mentioned it, but it's a case that continues to fascinate me today. While I was in school, going for history, I took a lot of psychology classes, and I was very drawn to forensic psychology. I've certainly applied some of that to the Zodiac killer's case. I'm certainly fascinated by that case. So that's one that sticks in my head, and I haven't done it recently, but up until a few years ago, I used to have the Zodiac's Unsolved 340 cipher tacked on my wall. And at least for 5 minutes a day, I would look at it and try and figure out what the hell was going on with that cipher. So that's certainly a case that sticks with me. Her second question is, are you in a relationship? If so, does your significant other ever get creeped out that you spend so much time researching abductions and murders? I am not currently in a relationship. I was up until a couple of months ago. It didn't seem to bother her. She wasn't a huge fan of the podcast. She never really listened. True crime interested her, but not enough. And she certainly knew me well enough to know that I wasn't going to murder or abduct her. However, since that breakup, I've gone on some dates, and when people learn what I do, it does seem to put them on edge, which I always find fascinating because my job, the way I see it, is to try and stop these things from happening and to try and find the answers to them. So people will often joke with me when we're going to go out and say things like, "Oh, well, don't murder me." That's really not what I'm interested in doing, and I've never thought of myself in that way. And I work in a realm where I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to hopefully create awareness that stops a murder from taking place. But yeah, people can get a little creeped out about it when they come to your house and you got papers all over your desk of missing persons and locations and psych workups on killers and suspects. It can be a little disturbing. Maybe it negatively impacts my dating life a little bit, but it's worth it to me. The next question comes from Charlotte Kent, who I know in person, and she asks, "What's a case that has disturbed you the most? What about it stands out to you? Are you too disturbed to report on it, or does it make you want to do it more?" Wow, that's a really tough question. What case has disturbed me the most? Arliss Perry. That's a very twisted case. There's so much weird iconography going on there with the church and the sexual assault that took place. It's horrible what happened to her. And not enough people have looked into that case. They have the DNA on file of the suspect, though they've never found him. I have my theories about that. But that's a very disturbing case. When I read it, the only thing that I considered in terms of not doing it was whether or not the listeners would want to hear a case that can be that disturbing. But at the end of the day, my thought on it is, these people had to live through these experiences, and most of them didn't make it. The people who were abducted had to go through something. The people who were murdered had to deal with this. And the people who care about them had to learn about what happened and deal with it on their own. So if their family can make it through, and if somebody paid the ultimate price and was murdered or kidnapped, and you can't bear to hear about it, well, I'm sorry, but you owe it to them to hear about it. Their life had value. And maybe it disturbs you, maybe you don't want to listen. And I don't begrudge anyone who skips an episode because it's a disturbing topic. But I'm certainly not going to avoid topics that disturb me, because they deserve answers just as much as the other ones. A lot of podcast hosts I know in true crime, they won't cover children's cases because it disturbs people too much. I think they're very important and they need to be covered more. So if a case disturbs you, if I think it's going to be overly disturbing, I try to put, some kind of a warning in there. But no, all cases should be covered regardless of how disturbing they can be. Where you draw the line is how gratuitous you are in the discussion of what happened. I am not going to give you the exact, important, most detailed description of a blow for blow murder that I can. I'll tell you someone was stabbed. I will tell you the amount of times. You don't need to know all of the details that are going to make it gruesome. So I try to just be selective about how much I tell you. If you want to personally go and read the autopsy reports, they're usually available for you to find.